Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on the topic of small but impactful things that we can do to improve mental health at work with the one and only Brandy Payne. My name is Victoria Granger, and I work with Wellness Works Canada. And if you're not familiar with us, basically we have a vision of building a healthier Canadian population and economy, one organization at a time. And so as an association, we support both workplace wellness practitioners and employers in building healthy, high-performing work cultures. And so what we do is we really just empower our members and people who aren't members as well with tools and resources that are simple and evidence-informed and cost-effective to help them, and certification as well, to really help them go towards achieving their goal of building healthy, high-performing work cultures while bridging the gap between employee well-being and organizational performance. So I do have just one quick announcement before we get started, which I'm really excited to tell you about. So just earlier this week, we actually launched the first of its kind. It's a workplace health and performance certification. And it's for workplace wellness practitioners. This particular level, which is for ambassadors, is really though for everyone who wants just to make a difference within their workplace to support employee health. Physical, mental, social, all of those things. And throughout the program, we help people bridge the gap between organizational performance and employee well-being. And it's included with membership. That's the best part of it. So those who are members can get access. There is a small admin fee for the ongoing feedback and then your certificate at the end, but it's pretty cost effective. And then you also do get support along the way, tailored feedback from an expert in the industry. And it's all asynchronous and self-paced, and it uses a pretty innovative piece of software that really allows us to assess and validate maybe competencies that you already have without having to do a whole bunch of other work or listening to boring lectures and that kind of thing. So we're really excited about that. If you want to get on board with that, if you're already a member, just email us at info@wellnessworkscanada.ca and we'll get you set up. And if you're not a member, sign up. It's only $100 a year for an individual practitioner. And then we have different types of memberships as well, but you can check out those online. Okay, so without further ado, and just in terms of the housekeeping, so today's webinar will be about an hour in length in total, with time for questions and answers included within that at the end. If you do have questions and answers or questions that you want to bring up, by all means, use the question function that is at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in the question and we will address those at the end. I already see one if we'll get the copies of the slides of the presentation today. So thank you for that. We will be recording today's webinar, and so we will be posting it online for everybody to be able to see and to read and to watch at your own leisure later on as well. So, so today I'm really excited to hear from Brandy. So if we just go on, so Brandy Payne, she really helps caring leaders improve mental health and psychological safety at their workplaces without overwhelming them or their teams, which is great. Sometimes it could be overwhelming, right? She works with clients to meet them where they are and get them to where they want to go one step at a time. Brandy is a Canadian Mental Health Association certified psychological health and safety advisor. And she's also served as the Associate Minister of Health in Alberta, where she was responsible for the mental health and addictions portfolio. And so she really draws on a combination of scientific research, best practices, and lived experience to help individuals and organizations improve mental health and psychological safety in businesses, in all different types of sizes and sectors. So she offers workshops and training and consulting as well. And so she can be reached at, and we will share this information at the end as well, at brandy@brandypayne.ca. Or you could just check out her website as well, which is brandypayne.ca. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Brandy and welcome you here to share your expertise. And I'm so excited as well to hear about these small and impactful things that we can do to improve mental health at work. Thanks, Brandy.
Well, thank you, Victoria, and welcome everyone. It is such an honor to be joining with you for this hour to have this chance to talk a little bit about some of the small yet impactful things that we can do to improve mental health at work. So this webinar, we're intending to kind of cover off a few tips. We've got 4 tips today that kind of imply for you, no matter which stage you're at with workplace wellness and mental health at your office. And also recognizing that the office, as we once knew it, is not really what we're seeing right now. A lot of folks are working from home. Some folks' workplaces are a bit of a blend of the two. And so these are tools that we can use regardless of where we're currently working and what our current workplace setup is. So just moving over to our agenda for today. So the first thing we're going to talk a bit about is why mental health matters more than ever before in our current times. We're also going to dive a little bit into the 13 psychosocial factors that impact mental health at work. And then we're going to move into our 4 small but impactful things, and then leaving some time for questions at the end. If we don't get a chance to get to your question before the end of the day, I will do my best to put together some answers, and perhaps Victoria can help us send those out to folks so that everyone has an opportunity to see the information. So moving right along, I have to say before we get much further, I have a little sticky note beside my camera that says speak slowly, because sometimes when I'm presenting, I get really excited and start to speak quickly. So hopefully I'll remember to speak slowly this whole time today. So why does mental health matter more than ever before? You're on this call because you know that mental health is an important issue. Now, we know that workplaces are not the end-all and be-all for mental health for individuals, but they can be a contributing factor to either mental health or to mental illness. And to that extent, we want to, build a workplace that is helping to support the mental health of the folks who work with us. So part of what that means is looking for things that might be having a negative impact and trying to address them where they can. And whether your team's working remotely, whether folks are in the office or somewhere in between, mental health impacts all of us. When we look at some of the numbers of mental health and what some of the impacts are, now these numbers that are up here on your screen are from before the pandemic. So this is things that we were seeing over the last several years, that 1 in 5 Canadians will experience a mental illness in any given year. Now that refers to folks who are having diagnosable mental illnesses. So not just the folks who are, maybe dealing with some extra stress and strain, maybe they're feeling extra worried, maybe they're struggling a little bit with burnout. Those aren't necessarily captured in these numbers. We also find that on average, 30% of short-term and long-term disability claims are mental health related, and those numbers tend to be rising. So, that's definitely something when we look at the costs to business, that's a pretty important number to be thinking about. It's also been found that about 3% of employed Canadians miss work each week due to mental health reasons. So those are the things like sick days that we sometimes see, or sometimes sick leaves. And so wanting to think about that and put it into a bit of context for the size of your workforce. So thinking about how many people you have on your team right now and applying some of those numbers kind of gives you a sense of the scope of why this is an important thing for workplaces to be thinking about. And then we kind of have the wave of coronavirus, right? And I think, particularly right now, this is a really important time to be thinking about mental health and be thinking about how we address and support mental health. That said, it's also a time when employers, managers, and people in the worksite are having a little bit less bandwidth and a little less capability of dealing with new and added things, because we already have so many new and added things as we're figuring out how to navigate the coronavirus and the restrictions from it, both in our personal and our professional lives. So when we think about that extra stress and extra strain on people, that's really all the more reason why we should be thinking about mental health, even if it's a little challenging to do so, which is part of why I felt that this topic was a pretty timely one for us in terms of simple and effective things we can do, because these are things that aren't going to take a lot of resources for your organization. They will take a little bit more time and a little bit more thoughtfulness, but at the same time, it is stuff that is pretty easy to incorporate. So again, when we think about the fear and the uncertainty relating to the impact on the economy, the impact on family economies, as well as some of the disruptions related to the coronavirus, it's really just compounding all of our current mental health challenges that we had already been experiencing before the coronavirus. And the piece too that makes this really important to think about in my mind is that, you know, we've seen some surveys already coming out that are showing that more than half of Canadians are feeling extra stress and extra fear and worry related to the coronavirus and impacts on personal and family economies, as well as their, you know, financial pressures at home. Daycare is still ostensibly closed. There's very limited spots for most people, things like that. And so there's a lot of stress and worry circulating. So it's a good time to be thinking about these important things. On that note, moving into the 13 psychosocial factors that impact mental health at work. So this is kind of the framework that I like to move from. It's based on the workplace mental health standard. So it has a very long title. It's the Canadian Standard for Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace. It was developed in between the Canadian Standards Association and the Mental Health Commission of Canada. And it basically sets out some voluntary standards for and a framework for companies and organizations of all shapes and sizes across sectors to use when they think about mental health and psychological safety in their workplace. So part of the goal of this is to begin to think about mental health and psychological safety in the same way that we already think about physical health and occupational health and safety. So most workplaces maybe have an occupational health and safety team, or you have someone whose job it is to, you know, make sure that nothing's going to fall off the ceiling and knock someone unconscious, or it's someone whose job it is to watch out for potential hazards in the workplace. Different companies have a different level of that, but the idea behind the standard is to begin to think about psychological health and mental health in the same sort of way that we look at physical and occupational health. So from that framework of the standard, there are found to be 13 factors that impact mental health that apply across sector and that are common across all companies. So moving to my next slide, I'll show you what the 13 are. Now, you do not have to memorize this. In fact, there's quite a lot of resources available on the internet for free that will guide you through how to apply these. And if it's something that you need some guidance on, that's what folks like myself who are psychological health and safety advisors are available to support you in your organization with. So I'll go through them pretty quickly. Most of them are fairly self-explanatory, but I feel like they create a really good guidepost of the ways that we can think about mental health at our own workplaces. A lot of companies and a lot of organizations, when they think about mental health at work, really focus on the first one, that's psychological support. That's looking at things like your extended benefits plans, things like your employee family assistance plan, and that sort of thing. So ways that we can support mental health for our teams outside of the workplace, as well as a little bit of support within the workplace. So that's thinking about how we talk about mental health at work, or if someone, you know, discloses a mental health concern to you, how do you respond to that? So that's where we look at psychological support. Organizational culture, that gets a little bit more into the way that our workplace works and the workplace interactions and having an organizational culture. I'm not going to define organizational culture because I think that's something that management books talk about to death. But the idea is that we want to create an organizational culture that takes mental health at work seriously and that honors people's mental health journey, knowing that we all have mental health. Sometimes we're in a good place mental health wise, and sometimes we're struggling. And also knowing that living with a mental illness does not mean that you necessarily have bad mental health. In fact, you can live quite healthfully with a mental illness in the same way that someone who has diabetes can really well manage their illness and be an active and healthy person. There's a lot of crossover in that way. And I think it's important to think of that as well. So when we talk about our organizational culture in terms of the psychosocial factors, we're thinking about, trust, honesty, and fairness, and the way that culture also thinks about mental health. Clear leadership and expectations is, I think, one that's particularly critical these days. And so that's about being clear with folks and having those open lines of communication, as well as making sure that leadership is being effective in their planning. And so really taking on that leadership roles. I can speak from personal experience. I've had experience with leaders where they're in charge, but they don't really want to take the lead role of saying, yes, we're doing this, no, we're not doing that, and just kind of let things kind of flow around in a way that's not necessarily helpful. So leadership is really about ensuring that we've got support for employees and that they know where they need to go and what is expected of them at all times. And if this is something that maybe it's the first time you're thinking about since some of the coronavirus restrictions came in, I really encourage you to think really long and hard about how you can be more communicative about some of that. But I don't want to get too deeply into my tips. Sorry, my cat just came to say hello. So moving from leadership and expectations, we also have civility and respect. And so that really just gets into the way that we talk to one another at work. And this is one that ultimately everyone in the workplace is responsible for. And so having those, when we talk to people, how are we treating them? Working from that place of respectful consideration and when we're interacting with our colleagues. Psychological competencies and requirements speaks to having that work environment where people are well matched to the jobs that they're doing. One of the examples I like to think about is if you have someone who's deeply introverted, does not like talking to other people, putting them in an outside sales role is probably not a good fit for their personality or for the way that they work in the world. Or for example, someone who's really timid and doesn't like setting boundaries, that person is going to need some extra support to take on a leadership role in your company, so that they're able to be that clear leader and set the expectations that they need. And so looking at not just work roles, but also, for example, work projects. So another example on that one is, for me, when I do a webinar or something like that, where I'm projecting out and doing that big, kind of speaking gig kind of thing, after these sorts of events, I need a good half hour to not talk to anyone, to just kind of recharge my own batteries. And so, if, for example, you are in that outside sales role, maybe you need a little bit of time to recharge or do something that helps to refresh you. And so thinking about within our own work jobs and our work sites, the ways that we can adjust that. Growth and development, pretty self-explanatory. What are the opportunities for growth and development on a personal and professional level? Recognition and reward, having that appropriate acknowledgement of employees' contributions. Sometimes it's even just as simple as saying, hey, thanks for getting that report done on time. Involvement in influence. We want to have employees and team members included in discussions about priorities and details around work as much as possible. And I think, especially these days, that's important when we're talking about returning to the office plans, because perhaps someone has a challenge with returning to the work. Maybe they have kids at home that they don't have a childcare option for. And so having those conversations and having people be involved and have some influence in those decision-making processes can really have a huge impact at work. We also want to think about workload management. So making sure we've got a level of tasks that can get done in the amount of time that we have, and shifting priorities to help make sure that the must-dos get done. Engagement, so feeling connected and motivated for work. Balance is kind of that, I like to think about balance not as a 50-50 scale, so much as more of one of those Bosu balls. They've got the flat top and the underneath is kind of rounded like an exercise ball, and you stand on it and you kind of wobble in different directions. And so for me, I think that's how a helpful way to think about the balance and the integration between our work lives, our personal lives, and our family lives, because oftentimes there's a little give and a little take, and sometimes one gets a little more attention than the other. And we just kind of try and find that space that feels well balanced for us. Psychological protection, basically just that we're going to be looking out for employees' psychological safety. So that touches in on some of the occupational requirements around a workplace free from bullying and harassment. And then protection of physical safety, again, making sure that workplace is a safe place to be physically for employees, which, you know, in these days, we're thinking about things like hand sanitizing stations, distance between desks, and stuff like that, so that we can keep employees safe during the time of coronavirus. So moving into some of the ways that we can improve mental health at work. I think this is an important thing to say, that these small ones are not necessarily simple. They make a big difference, and they don't usually take a lot of new resources in terms of funding or training for your employees. A lot of these are things that we can integrate regardless of where we're at our workplace currently for mental health supports. But they are things that can have a really big impact. So if you haven't already done these, I really encourage you to. And so each of them will relate back to one of our psychosocial factors. So the first piece is looking at your existing benefits and programs. So that's kind of touching on some of the psychological supports area of the 13 factors. So most companies over a certain size will have some kind of benefits program. Likely there's a little bit of psychological coverage in there. Likely you've got some medication coverage that would also extend to mental health related medication. And most benefit packages do come with an employee assistance program, or an EAP, also sometimes called an employee and family assistance program, so EFAP. So these are the things that you want to make sure that not only you as a leader know about, but that the folks in your team know about. Oftentimes when we start working somewhere, we dive into all the benefits as part of our onboarding, but we tend to forget that they're there. And so it's really important to make sure, especially in challenging times, that your team knows what's available to them. I really recommend, if you haven't ever contacted your EAP program, called the number or visited the website, to carve out a little bit of time to do that, so that when you're talking to members of your team about it, you have a sense of what's actually on there. A lot of them include mental health support. Some of them will have stuff that people can do on their own. Some will have referrals to outside support, but it's really a helpful thing to really get to know and dive into. Another piece to look at is, what do you have already for human resources in terms of policies and programs? So that'll include things like short-term and long-term disability programs, stay-at-work programs, and return-to-work programs. And these are really relevant when we think about mental health, because we often, think about when someone has a physical injury, for example, if someone's dealing with back pain and we need to make some accommodations for them so they continue to work and don't need to go off on a work claim or a short-term leave, we sometimes think about how we can accommodate staying at work and adjusting some duties so that they can keep coming to work, maybe on a reduced hours basis. And it's important as well to think about mental health in the same way. So if someone is going through a challenging time and they need to have a little bit of accommodation made, maybe shifting some of their duties in a way that makes sense for the company so that they can continue to work as opposed to needing time off for leave, that can be really helpful to have that both codified in your HR policy, but also to make sure that people understand that it applies for physical leaves as well as physical health related leaves, as well as mental health leaves. So, now's a good chance to look into some of those things, and knowing what they are and knowing how to communicate about them, should it be something that comes up in case someone discloses that they're having some mental health challenges. It's good to know what's available for them. The next tip is connecting on a person-to-person level. Now, this one is hugely important and is simple, but not easy. Partly because depending on your workplace culture and the way things are at work, you might not have an existing relationship with folks where they would feel comfortable or confident talking to you. Or maybe some folks have that good relationship where they can share how they're really doing, but other people don't. And, I'd like to think about that ancient Chinese proverb that the best time to have planted a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. In the same way, the best time to have developed solid relationships that are based on trust and an ability to communicate openly about how people are really doing is when someone first started. But if you don't have that, the next best time is now. And so I've pulled together a couple of ideas for ways that you can start to build those relationships if you don't already have them, as well as some reminders of ways to go about that. And which, especially when we're in a time when there's a lot of pressure and a lot of stress, like as we're dealing with a global pandemic, it's easy for some of these things to slide off the rails and kind of like fall to the list of like not criticals. And I want to really encourage you to think about the interpersonal relationships with your team as something that's always critical to be developing and always critical to be working on. And one of the reasons that that is true is because while it does take an investment of time up front, having that relationship and continuing to keep those lines of communication open means that you're going to hear about problems before they become huge problems. And I think anyone who's been in a managerial or leadership role for any length of time knows how big those problems can get and how much time can end up being spent addressing some of those problems, particularly if you end up in a situation where, someone has been having a tough time and maybe they're not performing as well in their role, and maybe it's having a negative impact on morale in the company. So we really want to think about trying to head those challenges off as soon as we can. So a couple of the ways that we can do that is, in the first place, by reaching out. The other day I was on a call and someone suggested the idea of just kind of like a care call, she called it, where they would just check in with colleagues from work without any agenda of anything relating to work, but just like hey, how are you doing? So kind of like a little coffee break in the middle of the day, to just check in with people and see how they're doing. And one of the best ways, in my experience, to open up those conversations, especially when we're trying to build rapport and build that relationship, is to start with yourself and talk about how you're doing. So one of the things that I've started doing during the course of this pandemic, because I know everyone has extra stress, I certainly do, is that when I talk to people and they ask me how I'm doing, I say I'm doing great. And then I share something that is maybe not as great that's going on with me. And so it leads to a bit more of an honest conversation, because after I say, I'm doing pretty good, though I have to, one that comes up for me a lot is my two young children are at home with us. And so sometimes balancing work and parenting has caused a lot of stress for me. So I'll talk a bit about that and how we're doing, or how taking over grade 3 teaching for my oldest is going. And so by having that conversation and opening with, I'm doing all right, but this is one of my challenges, I have found so many people are then more comfortable to open up with things that are challenging for them. And sometimes we can then talk a bit about it, maybe bounce some ideas back and forth about solutions, things that have worked for us or have not, or even just having that empathy and knowing that someone cares about how you're really doing and that it's a safe space to talk about how you're really doing. So while you're reaching out, it's important to be open about how you're doing, which isn't to say that we want to turn it into a vent session of everything that's ever gone wrong in our lives. But at the same time, saying, I've been feeling really tired, getting sleep's been really hard with my kids here all the time, or, whatever is real for you is, I think, really important. And then from there, also making sure to ask questions. And so giving people an opportunity to talk about how they're doing as individuals, and then really, really listening to them, asking them if it's something that you can support them with, and if there are ways to look for some possible solutions. Now, I don't believe that as a leader in your team, it is your job to solve every single one of your employees' problems. I don't think that's a realistic thing to expect. And I think that caring about your team's mental health doesn't mean that you're going to turn into their counselor or supervisor or mental health therapist. There are professionals for that, and that's who people should be talking to if they've got a challenge that moves beyond your comfort level. That said, I think that we can look for flexibility and for solutions where they are. So for example, if I was on your team and we were talking and I said, I'm having a hard time balancing my workload and getting the kids schooling done and making sure that I'm available online between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., it's just not working for me. You as my employer could then turn it around and say, okay, well, how can we address that? Like what are some thoughts that you have on how we can fix that, which would then give me an opportunity to talk about, well, my husband and I can switch off in the mornings and I can, before the kids wake up, I can get a couple hours in and I can get a couple hours in while they're in bed. But I can maybe aim for like a 4-hour chunk during the day where I'm online and available. And then we could negotiate what that timing looks like. Things like that. So having that idea of flexibility and trying to find solutions where they are. That said, always remembering that for a solution to work, it has to be something that's really going to work for the team as well as for the individual. And so, if someone says, I just can't make that 10 a.m. meeting because, the kids are here and it's a critical meeting, then having a conversation about, maybe it's okay if the kids come in, or like, how do we navigate that? Because we really need you at that time and we can't pick a different time. So where there's not opportunity for flexibility in scheduling, maybe setting some ground rules and support so that people know that you're doing your best to accommodate what they need, while at the same time respecting that you as an employer, as a manager, have some boundaries and some things that need to get taken care of. Moving along to the next one, kind of dovetailing with that, is being excessively clear in your communications. Now, I feel like this might be something that you may have heard a few times since mid-March, when schools and daycare shut down and everyone started working from home. But it's really important to remind ourselves that the clearer and more concise we can be, the better. There is just piles of research that show that when people are stressed or under additional strain, their ability to process complex and even medium ideas goes right out the window. And I think that if we're all honest, we all can share an experience that we might have had ourselves, where it's just so challenging sometimes to just keep things straight. And I think too, when we're thinking about, we're in an era where things are changing pretty rapidly. We just heard yesterday that the stage 2 of reopening for Alberta is being moved up a full week, when everyone was planning for a different date. And so now adjusting to what that all means and what the increased challenges and risks related to that might be. There's a lot for people to be processing, in addition to, okay, are we going back to work? What's going on with daycare? Are they changing the way the spots work? And I just keep going back to daycare because frankly, it's top of mind for me. And I think for anyone who has small children, that this is probably taking up a lot of mental bandwidth for all of us. But the idea of trying to be as concise in our communications and as clear and accurate. So saying the thing that looks like it's a really obvious answer. For the thing that you would think, be like, well, they could read between the lines on it. Don't leave it up to people to read between the lines. Just say it, because the more time that people spend trying to parse the meaning of communications, the less time that they have and less bandwidth they're going to have available for their actual job that you actually want them to be doing. So the more that we can be really concise and really explicit in our communications, the better. And an example of this would be, as you're thinking of, for example, if you're considering your return to the office plan, having that conversation with your team and really laying out in as plain language as possible what that's going to look like. So for example, if your building has elevators, what are going to be the rules around elevators? Are you turning some of your stairwells into one-ways? And if so, maybe just let them know which one's the like upstairs and which one's the downstairs before they even get to the office. That can be a really helpful thing, that they don't have to then think about rules around, lunch breaks and staggering times at the kitchen areas. Things like that are things that people are wondering about. Also, what's it going to look like to have meetings? What if I don't have childcare and I can't come into the office? What am I like? Is there accommodation available for that? And in some cases there can be, and in some cases there can't be. And ultimately that's something that you as an employer or manager have to make the decision about. But the sooner you can communicate that information to your team so that they can make appropriate arrangements, the better. So again, being clear, being concise, more of the information is better than less, but also recognizing that people are probably only going to process a couple of things at a time. And remembering that we don't need to know all of the answers right now. So for example, thinking back to the reopening in stage 2, a lot of businesses have just found out that things are changing a week sooner than they anticipated. They need some time to work out their plan. And so if you're one of the businesses impacted by that, I think it's really fair and probably even a good idea to reach out to your team and let them know that this is new information and we're going to process and see what we're going to do. We'll let you know as soon as we know. And so sharing the information that you have, giving people a chance to ask questions or raise concerns, and then from there, formulating kind of like the new plan and what's gonna happen. One of the questions too that people might be thinking about these days is like, how are we going to manage meetings? What happens if there's a change to which stage we're in case numbers spike? Things like that are all going to be really important conversations to be having at the workplace. And some of that will be information that you just don't know at this time. And so, it's fairly fair to say things like, this is where we're at for now. This is what we think we're going to do. We might have to change it, but we'll be in touch. We'll keep the lines of communication open. And we'll keep sharing the details with you folks as we learn them. So yeah, I think that's all I want to say about them. Sorry. So lots to say about communication, but I also feel like it's something that we've heard a lot about. And then the fourth tip is to take good care of yourself and, as much as possible, create a culture of self-care in your workplace. So I don't know about you folks, but for me, this one's the hardest. I will admit that I'm one of those people who, especially when things are busy and stressful, I sometimes slide off my self-care bandwagon. And I want to be really clear when I talk about self-care that I'm not talking about going for a massage, though I could really use one of those right now. I don't know about you folks. Or, having a bubble bath and those sorts of things. Those are, in some ways, can be more of like self-pampering and self-indulging and, fun stuff to do, but not necessarily self-care in the way that we think about it from a psychological standpoint. Self-care in this context, we're talking more about almost like the day-to-day maintenance of ourselves, or of our physical, our mental, our emotional, and our spiritual selves. So that's going to include things like going for a walk or working out. It's going to involve things like eating nutritious meals, getting rest when we need it, taking brain breaks so that we're able to stay focused on what we want to be focused on. It's going to be paying attention to our feelings and working our way through them as best we can. And then whatever spiritual practice is important to you, whether that's a gratitude practice or meditation, praying, or any kind of like more formal religious practice that you might have. And many of these things right now, in this time of coronavirus and not yet being in stage 2, have been really limited. A lot of the habits that we have around looking after ourselves aren't currently available for us, or are available to us in a different sort of way. Which is why I think it's even more important to be creative about our self-care and how we're looking after ourselves. There is a large and growing body research of how important this is for our success professionally as well as personally. So when we think about our workplaces, if our folks are kind of crumbling on the edges physically, or spiritually or emotionally, they're going to have a really hard time showing up for work in the way that we want them to and in the way that they want to, frankly. Self-care also works to support productivity as well as focus at work. And it helps us to manage our stress and our burnout and high demand work. Now, you may remember at the beginning, Victoria talked about how I used to be the Associate Minister of Health. So what that meant was that I was a member of cabinet. I live here in Calgary, and of course the legislature's up in Edmonton. And so I was in Edmonton 4 days a week, almost every week for several months while I was pregnant. And then I had an infant. So as you can imagine, with that kind of work demand, there was not a lot of time for self-care. I didn't have time to go to the gym for an hour. I didn't have time to go for a long walk. Also, my hips were killing me because I was pregnant. And there was long car rides. So there was a lot going on. And so I share this not to complain about my previous role because I loved that job so much, but because I get it. I understand how hard it can be to find some time for self-care, particularly for folks who work in jobs where there's a lot of forward-facing activity, where you're out in the public more, or in jobs where, there's just a lot to do and not enough time to do it. But the fact is that self-care doesn't need to take a ton of time, and that short and impactful things can happen in small periods of time. So maybe that's something as simple as taking a walk around the block, taking out 5 minutes to do some squats or something like that if you're physically able. Having some stretch breaks, that kind of thing. Sometimes hopping on a quick phone call or grabbing a quick coffee with a colleague can make a real difference. Now, of course, these are things we have to think of different ways to do in the current physical distancing. That said, having those sorts of things where we can do quick little resets for our bodies and our minds can be really helpful. Even taking, just sitting, closing your eyes and taking 10 slow, deep breaths can have an incredible reset on our bodies and play an important part of our self-care. So how do we create that culture of self-care? Because, I've worked with clients who have posters all over their office talking about self-care and looking after yourself and that kind of thing. But where emails get sent out late at night to people, or the idea of going for a break is just not what you do unless you're a smoker. And I've often thought that, us non-smokers need to take a page from the smoker's book, in a sense, of the idea of, a couple of times a day taking that 7 to 10 minute break to get outside, take some deep breaths, preferably not inhaling toxins. But having that time to be outside and maybe chatting with someone who is a colleague at work, to just kind of have that chance to kind of reset. So making sure that you build in a culture of taking breaks in your workplace. And then encouraging folks to, take a bit of a break for lunch, not working on their phone, but maybe doing something else. One of the workplace things that I've heard of that I think is really cool that people have been doing during the time of coronavirus is some workplaces have kind of an open Zoom call over the lunch hour where you can pop in and eat lunch and just chit chat with some colleagues over the lunch hour, or, introduce your pets when they hop on your lap, kind of thing. That kind of having that little bit of a scheduled time for downtime during the workplace, during the workday. But then also remembering to model the behavior of self-care. So if you tell your team that it's okay to take breaks, and they literally never see you take a break, and you're eating lunch at your desk and you never look up from your computer, they're not going to believe that you mean it. And so much in the way that those of us who are parents know that when we want our kids to do something, we have to model that behavior. So too, as leaders in our workplace, we have to model the behavior that we want to be seeing. Because if we're saying one thing and doing another, that can be really contradictory. And it kind of flies in the face of that, clear and concise communications piece. We want to be saying and doing the same thing. The other piece is to make a plan for self-care. I don't know about you folks, but if it's not in my planner, it doesn't happen. If something's not on my calendar, it just good luck. And so making sure that you make a plan for when you're going to do your self-care. You can have it be something that's really small, like, that 20-minute walk around the block, or even just like a 10-minute get outside and stretch or breathe. But making sure that you know when you're going to do that. An example for me right now is, so as I mentioned, I have small kids at home. My husband has his focus work period in the morning. Mine's usually the afternoon. And so every day after I eat lunch, I go for about a 15-20-minute walk. And I have a backup plan for if I have a sore throat and I'm not allowed to technically leave my house. I will walk around my backyard, but just then having it in my daily routine. And then after I'm done my walk, I stretch a little bit, and then I come downstairs and I'm ready to work. Another way to help think about planning for breaks and planning for self-care is something called the Pomodoro Technique, which is one of my favorite ways to do focused work. But the idea behind it is that you take a timer. I just use my cell phone, but it's based on a little tomato-shaped egg timer is where the name comes from. But you set basically a 25-minute timer, and you pick the task that you're going to work on for 25 minutes. No interruptions. So don't check email, turn your phone on silent, and just dig in for 25 minutes. Timer goes off, maybe stand up, do a few stretches, and then sit down for another Pomodoro. And so that's that 25-minute spurt. So things like that, and having those reminders in your phone is a really helpful way to make sure that you're taking those little breaks throughout your day. And there's a lot of productivity research that shows that when people are taking those breaks throughout the day and throughout their as they're trying to work through their task list, it really actually helps to refocus the mind. And our brain can really only focus for about 50 minutes at a time before it starts to wander, usually even a little less than that. And what'll then end up happening is if you don't have that opportunity for that focus and that break, your brain will start taking a break. So that's when those Twitter rabbit holes happen. That's when we start online shopping, those sorts of things. So when we plan for a little bit of break and a little refresh, that can really help us to stay on top, and is an important part of looking after ourselves and as part of our self-care. So that's just a quick little recap there. We've got, again, reviewing your existing programs, connecting on a person-to-person level, and being excessively clear in your communications, and then creating a culture of self-care. So small, not necessarily easy, but definitely impactful things. And then we'll open it up for questions.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Brandy. So many great, sorry, you might not have heard me there. That was really amazing, Brandy. Thank you for so many great tips. Like you said, some of them, they seem very easy, but sometimes, the implementation is sometimes a bit of another story. So we do have a few questions here. One was, do you have some examples of workplaces that are doing a really good job in this area, and can we learn from them? So this one came earlier. I don't know if you want to just put in your chat box, actually, if there was a specific topic that that was related to, that was near the beginning. I'll wait for that, and we'll go on to the next question to find out where exactly that fits. So this question's from Akeem. It says, do business leaders understand the impact of that mental health has? What do you think?
That is a fantastic question. And I think some do, but not all. And I think that is a really important piece of the work that folks like Victoria and I are doing, trying to get that word out and making sure that people understand the impact that mental health can have at the workplace. There's actually been in the last couple of years, quite a number of reports that have come out that support the impact. The Conference Board of Canada released I think it's a 4-part series. It's available through their website, talking about mental health at work and the impact that it can have. But as part of your question, like, do I think that the issue's really sunk in and people understand the extent to which it's important? I think we're slowly getting there. I think much like, occupational health and safety was a generation ago, there were folks that were like right on top of it and understood it from the get-go and were all over it. And then there were folks that it took a little while for them to catch up on why it was important. And I think in the same way, we're seeing that right now when it comes to workplace mental health and the impact on that for individuals. I do have available through my website, and maybe actually Victoria, I'll send it along with you. You can maybe send it to folks to kind of look at an infographic that goes over some of the costs as well as some of the benefits of the costs of workplace mental health not being addressed, as well as some of the benefits of moving towards it. Related to that question too, there was Deloitte came out with a report of it was at the end of last year that kind of surveyed some workplaces that were moving towards more of a strategy for workplace mental health and have been doing those investments in it for a few years. And they were finding like a pretty solid return on their investment. But what was interesting to me in that report as well was the notion that a majority of workplaces don't yet have a workplace mental health strategy. And that doesn't mean that you have to implement the entire workplace mental health standard, but you can definitely begin to think about how your workplace impacts with the different, the 13 factors, or even just looking at, those 4 tips that I shared today. That's a really great point to be working from. So making sure that all of that is a piece that's happening in your workplace, that it's conversations being had at different levels. And then from there, beginning to move, once that's feeling solid and ready, you can also then begin to expand that a little bit broader. So I'll send along the infographic that I have, and then Victoria can send it out so that folks can have that at their fingertips if they need to make that conversation at work.
Sounds great. Yeah, it's there's growing acceptance and awareness, but there's still more to be done. And so those resources are really helpful. I have another interesting question here. It says, would the built environment or workplace design fall into any of the 13 factors?
Ooh, I love that question.
Yeah,
My instinct is yes. And now I'm looking at my sheet. I keep a little sheet of them by my desk. I even have like a little sticky note that I always see that lists them because that's how important I think that they are. I think that it plays in a number of ways. I think the built environment can have an impact on how sorry, I was looking at the list and then I lost my train of thought. I think the built environment can have an impact on how we're able to do our jobs, as well as how the workplace impacts us. And so I think that maybe it would fall a little bit into the psychological competencies and requirements piece in a way, because that one talks about how our work and our work environment can impact or interacts with our interpersonal and emotional competencies as well as the requirements. So that might be one of the areas where it goes. But I think it is an important piece to consider for sure, because, when we think about, for example, a cubicle type environment or an open office environment where there's a lot of noise and background, that can have a really serious impact on people's ability to focus, particularly for folks whose brain wiring is such that they are easily distracted or easily drawn out of their work. And so thinking about things like noise canceling headphones and quiet spaces that people can go and work in is, I think, really important when we're looking at that.
Yeah, and to that point, Graham Lowe actually just published a paper about And it's a really interesting topic. It just kind of took me aback when I first read it. It's something related to would employee health, well-being, and performance. And I think it ties in a little bit some of these things and talks a little bit about the impact of having, good lighting and access to natural things like wood that bring you closer to nature, and all of these things that can influence your well-being and mental health and performance. So it's interesting.
Well, and dovetailing a little from that too, sometimes even just little things like adding plants to the workplace can have a really good impact on people's physical and mental health, like just having that extra greenery and then the bonus oxygen from the plants.
Exactly. That all helps, right? For sure. So I have another question here. It says, if leadership say they support healthy habits such as breaks and self-care, but they don't mirror it, like you said, or the culture doesn't support these healthy habits, how can employees go about to address and make this change?
Oh, that is such a fantastic question. And I think that that's actually where the rubber meets the road a little bit on these sorts of things. And particularly when we talk about organizational culture, there's often, like the workplace says, like, this is the way we believe that everyone deserves this, that, and the other. And then, but we want you to do it exactly our way and maybe not that way. And so I think, having one of the ways that we can do that ties back into one of our 4 tips from today, which is excessively clear communications. And so, in the same way that we understand that the smokers on our team are going to go out for a smoke break from time to time, I think having the conversation with your boss that says, look, I'm going to schedule my coffee break for 10:15 if we don't have anything planned. Let me know if there's anything that comes up and I can adjust that, but I'm going to be taking a 15 then. And, most of our, your company might have HR policies that discuss like when like break times and entitled breaks and that sort of thing. An important piece to remember too is that here in Alberta, under occupational health and safety, if you're working more than a 5-hour shift, you are entitled to 30 minutes of unpaid break time. And so it's not that your coffee break is going to be covered, but just letting your boss know that you're going to be taking that time, so that they know as well what you're up to. And whether your coffee break is you literally sitting there drinking coffee, or if it's, you using the time to go for a walk around the block, that's really up to you. But I think having that communication about taking breaks and start and end times, I think can be really helpful. I think one of the things that this current situation with coronavirus has brought us is that because we're not in the workplace, we do have to be a little more clear about that sort of stuff. And so saying, listen, at 5 o'clock, I got to go take over on watching the kids. So I'm done at 5. I can, like, if something's urgent, maybe I can take care of it, but like I'm kind of off until 9. And then having those conversations, I think can be really important, particularly too, if your company's got something written down in about the culture for that, or policies around that, you can then, point to those and just say, look, this is what we're working with. And if there's challenges, like having that conversation as best you can.
Yeah, I love that. And because it is a bit of a shared responsibility too, right? You have to have the open communication and those healthy boundaries both ways. So I have a question here from Robert. He says, can you tell everyone about the resource workplace strategies for mental health?
Yeah, Robert, that's a big question.
There
are so many resources that are out there. There's quite a lot of really helpful resources that are available through the Canadian Mental Health Association, as well as through the Mental Health Commission of Canada. And both of those organizations have workshops and training programs that are available. There's a lot of great stuff that's been done through, that was me thinking of the name of the website. The Workplace Strategies for Mental Health website has quite a lot of information that was done in support of the implementation of the Psychological Health and Safety Standard. But one of the untapped and unknown resources that I think are out there are the CMHA, or Canadian Mental Health Association, certified workplace health and safety advisors, of which I'm one. But, so we're folks that have gone through a training program on how to implement the standard and use the psychosocial factors to help tailor those things to your individual business and what it is that you're looking for, what your goals are. And so I think, for a lot of workplaces, there's a lot of really great information out there, but sometimes knowing what's the best fit or what's the best next step for your organization can be a challenge. And so that's where I think folks like the workplace health and safety advisors can really help with getting you on the track that makes the most sense for you.
Yeah, there's so many great resources out there, like you said, and Wellness Works Canada is actually a partner with the Mental Health or the Canadian Mental Health Association as well, and so a lot of our resources and support align with the standard, and so those can be helpful too. So I have just a comment here from Nancy. She says, "I think self-care is a way of life. Too often it is described, just as you indicated, a massage or bubble bath. Wellness professionals need to be sure that they do not promote self-care as a quick fix." So just thanks for highlighting that. So it's just kind of a thank you. But I do have another question here as well from Robert. Can you tell us about the Alberta legislation? And so we do have a national audience, just for perspective. But anyways, around the psychological health and safety in the workplace. And I think there's a lot of similarities between what's happening in other jurisdictions as well. But
yeah, so each jurisdiction does have a slightly different set of legislation and different impacts for employers. The legislation that was passed in Alberta a couple of years ago now. Sorry, that whole time's a blur for me, I'm going to be honest. That one speaks a lot to the responsibility that employers have around creating a psychologically safe workplace, insofar as specifically focusing on the issues of harassment and bullying, taking harassment beyond sexual harassment, but other types of harassment as well. And so it basically helps to codify some of the responsibilities that employers have, that if there's a concern that's raised by an employee, that is something that they're going to want to be able to have a response to, maybe do an investigation to, in the same way that they would for an occupational health and safety one. So fabulous question, but I'm not convinced we have enough time to really dive into the details of how that impacts. But certainly there's it's something for workplaces to consider. And then I think there's also a lot of space to look at what the requirements are, and then also think about how your workplace can be a leader on these issues and really help to support your team.
Mm-hmm. We do have actually an article about that outlined the legislation requirements in each province, territory. So we can share that as we follow up. But I have reached the end of our time today. So I really want to give a really great big thank you to Brandy Payne for coming and sharing some really insightful, impactful things that we can do. And we will be following up with you afterwards with a recording of today's webinar, as well as a couple of those resources that we mentioned. And just to let you know as well, we do actually have another webinar coming up on June 24th, and it's on the topic of mindful leadership with Lena Bill. So if you're interested in that, we'll send the link out for that as well. And then again, if you're interested in the certification, which also can help support you in developing and understanding how to take kind of a strategic approach to supporting your organization or the organizations that you work with, you can check that out as well. But and then for all of Brandy Payne's resources and support that she offers, please check out her website, brandypayne.ca, or email her at brandy@brandypayne.ca. So thank you very much, and we will be in touch, and have a great rest of your week and stay well. Thank you.